Good morning, everyone. I have the huge pleasure to present my very close friend and colleague, Christine Brodsky, better known as Christine Rega-Brodsky. She is currently assistant professor of urban ecology at the University of Missouri, where she happened to finish her PhD, advised by one of the most amazing urban ecologists ever existed, Charlie Nylon. So Christine has been working in huge projects, some of which have been among the most well-known long-term ecological researchers in the world. She was part of that while being a PhD student. And as a researcher, as an assistant professor now, she's among those people that have enough bandwidth to try to put together social perceptions with a really strong, hard-boiled ecological part and trying to make sense out of all of that into real-world application. Christine and I have been collaborating for a while now. She will be around for some more weeks. So if you're also interested in contacting and chatting with her more personally or exploring collaboration, I see some urban ecologists. You have a rising star in urban ecology that you can reach out to in Christine. And she's really a very nice person, additionally, which sometimes it's not that easy to get all in a combo. So thank you so much, Christine, for coming. And please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for that overly kind introduction. And thank you all so much for inviting me and having me. It's really a joy to be back in Helsinki. Ian and I was here 2 years ago for my sabbatical, so it's really lovely to be back. So thank you for your very kind invitation and joining us this morning. So I wanted just to talk a little bit about some themes that have been present in my research over the past, 10 years or so at this point, where we can, like Ian said, jointly put together our knowledge of biodiversity goals and planning in cities, but also take into account that humans are living in these spaces. We need to account for the human dimension of any management actions that we are planning on implementing in these places. So today I just wanted to share 2 examples of projects that my colleagues and I have been conducting in 2 very different cities and very different types of green spaces, from vacant lots to managed parklands. And hopefully by the end we can have a really nice discussion of some of these things, because one of the projects is ongoing right now. We are just still collecting data, so it would be lovely to talk about it. So, majority of my talk today is going to be about urban green spaces. So we know that they are incredibly heterogeneous across the entire city and across different cities, whether we are talking about their size, their contents, how connected they are to one another. So I'm an urban wildlife ecologist by training, so I am viewing these places as potential habitat for a variety of species across different taxonomic groups. But at the same time, we recognize that these green spaces mainly have been designed and maintained for people and how we interact with these places in our everyday lives in our cities. So just as examples of green spaces and how we interact with them, they could be places like this in Peru, where you're just passing through on your way to work. You might be listening to some of the bird calls up in the canopy, or see a little squirrel run across the pathway, where you're just kind of going through these on your everyday journey, but at the same time they're places and providing opportunities to relax, to unwind as you're going and starting off your day. So not only are we providing habitat for a variety of species, but we are also managing these places clearly for people. Other places and green spaces throughout the world, we are planting trees and shrubs and whatnot, mainly for an abiotic portion of the services that these spaces provide in terms of pollution regulation, urban heat island mitigation, but again, also as places to enjoy from our day-to-day travels. These places are also incredibly important for community engagement and cohesion, where we can bring kids out, families out, educational groups in order to enjoy these places, not only for recreation like we see here in Cape Town, but also places for outdoor education, whether formal or informal education, while at the same time interacting with our wildlife, with the plants, insects, and whatnot that we find in these places. And these form really important connections, especially as we are developing what we experience in our cities from these young ages, and that's going to influence the values that we develop over time, which then will impact the actions that we take as we progress through our careers, but also through our ages. But there are a whole bunch of different varieties, obviously. This is one of my favorite green spaces in the world. This is the High Line in Manhattan in New York City. It is a converted raised railway that was abandoned and it was taken over. And now is this beautiful botanical garden where it's in a really dense portion of New York. So it is a really fantastic place to kind of escape the chaos of the city and take a walk during your lunch break, sit down, read a book. So they're incredibly important places for that kind of escape and to rejuvenate your mental and physical health while interacting with nature in a very dense part of the world. So green spaces, the theme today is really how can they benefit both wildlife and biodiversity planning, but also the people aspect, how people are interacting with green spaces, how they are perceiving these spaces, and thus how are they going to enact any actions as we think about planning. So there's a huge variety of the, I guess, biodiversity aspect of these places, from our remnant habitats, which are few and far between in a lot of our developed cities, but there are still patches that remain of this leftover vegetation where in terms of our temperate forested ecosystems, they may have larger trees, they have a closed canopy, some coarse woody debris on the ground and leaf litter, which is fantastic for our insect communities, and then that scales up obviously from to birds, mammals, etc. But they tend to be rather small, fragmented, have a lot of edge effects, so may not be great, but it's wonderful to still have, if at all possible, in terms of our wildlife. And on the other end of that spectrum, we have these highly managed city parks with a lot of turf grass, a lot of management action, maybe a tree or two, but generally an open space, which can support a different guild and different functional groups of whatever organisms we are discussing, but we can safely say that that is less positive in terms of habitat resources available to urban wildlife. But at the same time, these tend to be excellent for people and utilizing these spaces for recreation as they are managed, safety perceptions, etc. We also have residential green spaces, which is not going to be the focus of my talk today because that's a whole other level of variables and things that we need to take into account. But we do recognize that that is a large percentage of our green space in cities. And then obviously our developed lands that have maybe street trees or some other minor features as we go along. But this diversity of the different types of green spaces that we have in cities, their locations throughout the urban matrix, is then going to tie into the wildlife that we find in our cities. So all of these species, these are all photos that I've taken. All of these critters are found in cities, in this case throughout the United States, from our highly carnivorous species like our coyotes and our bobcats, to our herpetofauna, to even this elk that was just hanging out in someone's backyard, which is just crazy to think about. So there's a lot of opportunity to provide habitat for wildlife that are in cities Some are more specialized than others, like river otters. They have great populations in urban areas, but obviously they need to be tied to some waterways of some respect. So we already see that these species are here. I'm interested in how we can support this diversity in these green spaces. But again, at the same time, in the back of my mind thinking, well, what are people going to think? How are they going to interact with these spaces? Are they going to support these actions of managing these spaces for wildlife, or is it going to become an issue? So for instance, these bobcat kittens, which have been my all-time favorite camera photo that I've taken so far, this green space, it was in a city, but in terms of biodiversity, it's fantastic. We have a closed canopy, really dense shrub layer, so a lot of really great wildlife cover, leaf litter on the ground, fallen wood. But for people, this is not the most supported. This was taken in Kansas, so right in the middle of the United States, and right now we're dealing with huge issues with human health and disease with ticks in these communities, so small insects that transmit a variety of pathogens that have long-lasting impacts. So people are not going to want to walk through that green space, even if there is a small trail, with that fear of being exposed. So there's a lot of social health implications, aspects that we need to incorporate into these kind of biodiversity plans while still maintaining and supporting biodiversity in cities. So when we think about these interactions, we typically view in two separate groups while still recognizing this is a very complicated relationship and there's a lot of things going on. But just for simplicity, we have two competing interests. One, supporting biodiversity goals overall in green spaces, and the other, how people interact. So we can think about them in terms of the regulating and supporting ecosystem services that these spaces provide, like water filtration, air pollution, regulation, biodiversity supports, but also cultural services. So the aesthetics of the site. Does the site look pretty, or does the site look messy, unkempt, scary if it's an unsafe area? How are people connecting with these spaces? How are they utilizing them? Is it for recreation? Is it for a place to go out and socialize? So we can think of these two things and plan accordingly. So let's say we have a building that is in the process of being demolished. We are going to create a new green space in a city. In simple terms, one of two things can possibly happen. So if we were to demolish this site and be left with open space, we can go to one extreme and say, we're going to be completely hands-off. Maybe we don't have the funding right now to really manage a green space, so we're going to demolish, remove the rubble, and let things grow willy-nilly. We can result in a green space like this, where it's incredibly dense, tall ground cover, dense shrub layer, which may or may not have an insane amount of invasive, non-native plant species. We have some trees maybe growing up, vines, etc. For wildlife, this is fantastic. We are providing cover and food resources, shade, for a variety of, my mind always goes to bird and mammal species. So this is really fantastic in terms of the regulating and supporting services that this law can provide. We support biodiversity, we support primary production, air purification, carbon sequestration. But we are incredibly low on that cultural service. People do not like this type of lot in their neighborhood. It looks messy and unkempt. In some areas too, where crime is an issue, you can't see straight through the site. Someone can be kind of hiding out, and there's a lot of concerns with that. And I'll talk a little bit about that with our conversations about vacant lots today. So that's one potential. Another potential is to go really high on that cultural service aspect, where if we demolish this place and We let it go to a green space, but we manage it very intensely. We have a lot of turf grass. We mow it regularly. In terms of this type of green space in the United States, people love it. We love our lawns. We love to have that management over our space. This is great for recreation, going out, playing football, going out for a picnic. It is aesthetically pleasing. It's maintained. We have those cues to care. But in terms of biodiversity, it is the worst thing that we can do, right? We are possibly utilizing herbicide or pesticides. Our insect populations are rather low. Maybe it's good for Canada geese or deer that's browsing through, but that's really it. There's not any structural complexity in this space, so it's low. So these are two extremes. Obviously, there's a lot of things in between, but the question that I always ask myself, can we create some kind of balance between these two? Recognizing our biodiversity goals, but we are in a space that are run by people and going to be utilized by people. So that is kind of the theme today, but also when we are trying to figure out that balance, we need to understand how people are interacting with these spaces. So we have the experiences that we have growing up and how we interact with spaces. So there are a huge variety of ways that we could interact with urban nature. Some may be positive. Let's say you grew up and you go with your family out on a picnic or fishing at a local lake, walking trails, listening to bird song, maybe feeding birds in your backyard, developing those positive experiences. So in adulthood, you may have more opportunities to interact. On the other hand, maybe growing up, you got attacked by a Canada goose because you were walking through a park and it kind of ran after you and nipped you. So those are not great experiences, maybe taking you away from urban nature, and you want everything to be lawn and very little exposure in that sense. So this experience will directly influence how you perceive green spaces and other type of urban nature. So if we have positive nature interactions from childhood all the way up to adulthood, that is then going to relate to positive perceptions generally, maybe supporting biodiversity action where we can plant more native species because you have those experiences knowing that that will then facilitate these things that you remember, or maybe go out and birding, listening to birds. These are the positive things that we then perceive, and then that is a reciprocal relationship continuing these positive experiences overall. So these two are in flux, but also with actions that are supported through these relationships. So this is the perception, experience, action framework, where these actions are the result of how we perceive our urban nature, which then is influenced also by the experiences that we have in these sites. So all of these inform one another, and we need to take into account how they are interacting as we move forward and suggest some management actions in our cities. So to tie those thoughts together, I just wanted to share two examples of case studies that my colleagues and I have been doing, just to touch on two incredibly different cities and two very different types of green spaces in the United States. So the first example I want to talk about is an example from Baltimore, Maryland, which is a city on the eastern coast of the United States. And this city, really interesting history, and it currently has a lot of issues with vacant land and vacant lots, which are a very different type of green space that we typically interact with. So talk first about that, and then I will end today talking about a very new project that my colleagues and I just started. We only have 2 months of data, so we are in the data collection process right now. And this is occurring in Columbia, Missouri, where my university is located, so right in the middle of the country. And in that project, we are looking at managed parks. So two very different green spaces with two different types of potential and uses and needs to address. So, kicking us off in Baltimore. Baltimore, Maryland is a coastal city in the United States. It is located on the east coast off of the Atlantic Ocean, and then this Chesapeake Bay right in the middle of it. So a lot of connections with industry and shipping in terms of what job prospects are there and the history of the city and how it's come to be. It is quite large of a city in terms of human population density and the administrative footprint, and it is a metropolitan area that is very clearly connected with a lot of other metro areas along the East Coast. It's very close to Washington, D.C., but it also connects all the way up through the eastern coast of the United States. This city is also unique in that it is one of the, or used to be one of the urban long-term ecological research projects. So we have data from this city from the early 1990s about bird communities, water quality, but also how people interact with nature in Baltimore. So just a brief history about this city and how these green spaces are going to be put into context. So back in the 1950s, Baltimore was doing really great. It had its peak population of just under 1 million residents because of the healthy manufacturing and shipping industry that was going on at that time period. But since then, with the slow, not collapse, but reduction in that industry from the 50s to early 2000s, we've been experiencing a huge decline in the population in Baltimore City. So massive amounts of job loss, which then related to people moving out of the city or abandoning their homes. So we see this increase in vacant housing, loss of income. In that time period, we also see a massive increase in crime rates, especially with the drug epidemic in the 80s and 90s. So a lot of folks in this time period started moving out of Baltimore into the neighboring county, which is much more wealthy, more suburban, if you will, escaping out of Baltimore City. So that leaves us with today, where we now just have a population of Baltimore of just over 500,000 people. And that relates to a 39% loss from its heyday in the 1950s. So like Detroit, Michigan, Baltimore is considered a shrinking city. So these are types of cities that we don't often talk about in urban ecology. We're talking about cities that are growing and how to manage the integration of green spaces because cities are growing so fast. That opposite is occurring in Baltimore. We are now dealing with more vacant properties, more green spaces than we know what to do with. So because of this history, Baltimore is known for the amount of vacant spaces that we have in cities, in this city in particular. So in Baltimore, they define a vacant lot as a place in the city that has the potential to be built upon. So it is an open space that eventually could be built. These spaces are owned by the city of Baltimore, and they are pervasive. There are over 16,000 parcels of vacant properties in Baltimore. Some are quite large, and they're mainly in the industrial area of the city. Others are narrow and are on waysides along roadways or railway lines, but they are found throughout the entire city of Baltimore. And this, granted, is an older map from 2015, but the same thing is still occurring today. But back in 2015, 7% of Baltimore was considered vacant and unused. So a lot of opportunities here to take these parcels of land to manage it for biodiversity and also for people. Because unfortunately, it is something that people do not like to have in their neighborhoods. So this is a satellite image and Google Map image of the same place in Baltimore, just to show the configuration of the homes that are there, but also the vacant parcels. So Baltimore is also known for its unique architecture. It's called a row house. They are really long and thin homes that flank the city block of Baltimore. And that creates not only these pockets inside of the row homes where they can be used, whether it's for parking or play in the center of it, but it still has the potential to be built upon. Historically, back in the early 1900s, there were buildings here, but they have since been demolished in favor of just retaining the primary homes. But with that movement out of Baltimore, the abandonment of homes and the demolition of many of these properties, we have these huge chunks, but also these small fragments in between these houses that are now sitting vacant. So they're found throughout the city, and people are interacting with these every single day. It is not a far off issue. These are quite literally in their backyards. So when we are talking about all of this abandoned land that the city owns but may not really be managing well or at all, it's become a massive social issue. So they are incredibly exposed to city residents. So for instance, like this is a row house, but the vast majority of that block is now vacant. People in Baltimore associate a lot of these vacant lots with weedy, shrubby vegetation. They don't look pretty, they're overgrown. The city of Baltimore technically should be mowing these spaces, I think once or twice a year, but rarely does that occur because there are so many spaces. So I got an earful whenever I would visit about what the city needs to be doing. But it's created this social issue where because they're abandoned, they are not looked after, they are perceived to be neglected. People think that they're associated with crime, illegal dumping and littering, which then exacerbates the situation, but overall, that feeling of neglect and not lacking pride of their community. So that's throughout Baltimore, but at the same time, people are resilient, and there are opportunities that the city of Baltimore provides to these neighborhoods to buy back these vacant properties at a nominal rate in order to create community spaces. So the community spaces can eventually be turned into gardens for flowers or urban agriculture to support the community, spaces for recreation, but also spaces for the community to come together and to build those social connections, like this place, this vacant lot in Baltimore, where the community came together and created this quiet place, put in some benches, some barbecue grills. They even painted the side of a wall white to project movies in the summer. So it's a really great place to interact with urban nature and at the same time build those social and familial bonds. So there's a lot of potential here for the social aspect of green spaces in cities. At the same time, I'm an urban wildlife ecologist. I'm interested in how these spaces can provide habitat for organisms that we are interested in studying and are good indicators of biodiversity and overall health. So we came into these vacant lots to not only survey the wildlife and vegetative communities in these lots to understand what's even there. So we surveyed bird communities in these spaces, but also the plants that are found in vacant lots. But at the same time, pairing that with a social survey where we asked people, you know, what kind of lot would you like to have in your neighborhood and why? What about this makes you want to have this type of lot? So assessing not only preference, but how they are perceiving these spaces and what they're connecting these photographs with. And all of these lots were ones that we already surveyed. We knew the bird community, we knew the plants that were in these lots. So in terms of the wildlife, I was frankly surprised with the amount of birds that we found in these spaces. We found 60 species in vacant lots throughout Baltimore, and these were the 10 most common bird species. So many of these are incredibly common and found worldwide, like in the US at least, are non-native invasive starlings and house sparrows and rock doves, but we also have some urban adapted species like American robins, cardinals, and catbirds that folks really loved to see in these spaces. We also had migratory warblers come in, and these species were also breeding in Baltimore. So we did a lot of connections with how well these communities were responding to the vegetative communities in vacant lots. We found that overall the bird community responded positively to the amount of tree cover locally, so within 100 meters, so not too far away. We found that the number of bird species were positively related to the amount of forest cover found there. So looking at that community perspective, but also we decided to tease apart some particular species and how they were responding to features in these vacant lots. And what we found when we were looking at the properties of these vacant lots, and when we threw them into an ordination, two vacant lots kind of arose. One, the vacant lot that looks like a park, but this is a vacant property. It is owned by the city. It can be developed at any point, but it is highly managed. We have some trees, so a slightly closed canopy, but the city is taking good care of these ones. These are obviously located in more wealthy areas of Baltimore, so there's a lot of social implications of this as well. But this is a vacant lot, and we found a particular bird community here, and these were more so our urban adapted species. Even nuthatches were utilizing these sites more often. The other type of vacant lot is one that if we think of what does a vacant lot look like, it's this. It is weedy, it is not managed. We have some impervious cover sprinkled throughout from the time where it was developed. We have a completely open canopy, slightly more dense shrub layer. And in terms of the species that were responding to these types of vacant lots, we had more so our urban birds like our starlings. Our chimney swifts, which were utilizing especially the abandoned homes in these spaces, but also mourning doves. So species were very specific in what types of lots they were utilizing. So found really good, really interesting trends there. And not only were we interested in what species were present, but also the future of these sites. So we wanted to incorporate some nesting data and some reproductive data to see what the future bird community would be like in these locations. So we focused on 3 of these very common nesting species in vacant lots. So we have the American robin, northern cardinal, and gray catbird, and we monitored their nests from when eggs were laid to when the young fledged in order to determine what features of the vacant lots best supported the successful nesting of these species. And what we found was that was really driven by the amount of shrub stems and density of shrubs in these vacant lots. So that doesn't surprise me. There's the really dense areas of shrubs. If that bird puts a nest there, it is protected from aerial predators, even maybe some cats. I found one time a cat sitting on a nest eating the birds. So the things that we find in cities. So that's great for wildlife, but if I were to go to city government and be like, all right, the one thing that we have to do for bird communities and bird conservation in cities is to put more shrubs in these spaces. We're like, absolutely not. That's never going to happen. But the positive thing that we found, while shrub density best supported nesting bird and their success, it didn't need to be completely covered in a vacant lot. Vacant lots generally were open, but had pockets of dense shrub areas, and that was sufficient to get them to succeed in their reproductive capabilities. So those were our wildlife data. Now let's talk about the survey results. So out of all of the lots that we presented for the public, this was the most preferred vacant lot. from our city residents. And again, since we knew the contents of these lots, the preference scores were correlated to tree size. So people preferred lots with larger trees. And when we asked them why that was, they described these lots having trees, a lot of grass, it's maintained, it looks beneficial, it's park-like, it's mature. People were responding to the presence of these green features, to the closed canopy to create shade, but also to the management of these sites. So even though we do have some smaller trees in the shrub layer and some large mature trees creating that closed canopy, we have a lot of open space, and we have patches where we do have some mowed grass for people to use this space. So that is good to know, because we can merge what we've just talked about with the bird community, but also meet human goals and needs and wants in these spaces that are within their day-to-day activities and lives. Unsurprisingly, this was the least preferred vacant lot. People did not want to have this type of vacant lot in their neighborhood. And their preference scores were related to artificial ground cover, so they preferred areas that had more pavement or concrete less. So, and that correlates back to that green connection that we just saw on our last one. But people described these types of lots as neglected, abandoned, it has trash, it's vacant, it's ugly. It's a lot of negative terms, but at the same time, we found a lot of optimism in these sites. So they have potential. So it's still green, there's still plants, there's still wildlife in nature. So we kind of have this inkling of, okay, it's not all doom and gloom. They see that this can easily become an important space socially, but also ecologically. So can we achieve a balance? I think we can in vacant lots, and Baltimore has a lot of them. It is going to be a slow process, but moving forward, we know from birds that trees were important to host a more rich bird community. We know that areas, small areas of dense shrubs are great for nesting habitats and success of these birds. But for people, we also want to see those trees, those shrubs, those green features that people responded positively to. But at the same time, having small areas of maintenance and mowing, or having a park bench put in, those cues to care where these lots can be used and have that positive perception in these neighborhoods. So that was about 5 years worth of projects and data, and this project will always have a special place in my heart, because vacant lots are, I think, an incredibly interesting green space in cities. So moving from a very contentious social issues concerning vacant, or concerning green spaces in cities, to a less contentious issue. This project that we are currently collecting data for is in Columbia, Missouri. So moving further into the country in the US, it is right in the middle of the United States. It's an interesting city in that it is on the transition zone between the forest to grassland ecoregions. It's incredibly flat. It doesn't have a lot of development. We have these pockets of cities surrounded by a lot of agriculture and a lot of remnant forest in this area, or grasslands if we look a little bit further north. So compared to Baltimore, very different. Just briefly, Columbia, Missouri right now has about 130,000 residents. So compared to 500,000 in Baltimore, it is a smaller city by population, but also by footprint. So it is much more condensed. Columbia, though, one of its great features is that we really value parkland. So we have 75 parks, both city-owned and state-owned, so a lot of opportunities for nature-based recreation. And the great thing too, we currently have a government in Columbia that is trying to support more of these interactions. So our current mayor, her goal is to have some kind of green space within 5 minutes walking from your home. So whether that is a trail that connects to a larger patch or a playground, it's a great initiative, and I hope she is successful with that. So urban parks are a big priority for this city, and it doesn't really have a lot of social contentious issues like vacant lots in Baltimore, but it's something that we need to, again, balance with biodiversity planning. So we can create these managed parklands for recreation by having a lot of open space, turf grass to kick around soccer balls and whatnot, or playgrounds, but these often don't relate to supporting biodiversity. So kind of on the opposite end of what we just were talking about in Baltimore, how do we take these spaces that are really positively supported for social interactions, but how do we continue to manage them for biodiversity planning? So my colleagues and I have decided to explore many of these managed park spaces that are owned by the city to determine how people interact with biodiversity when they're going out for recreation. Can they even perceive what biodiversity is there? Do they think we have a lot more species that are there or not? How are they perceiving the aesthetics of these spaces in terms of wildlife communities? We decided to use birds as an indicator, because birds are awesome, and tie in these connections to these cultural ecosystem services. So how are people perceiving the aesthetics of these birds? Do they like to listen to birds, watch birds, or do they find them messy and gross and things like that? We were also interested in how people were perceiving these spaces for their mental and physical health, and also how they were functioning ecologically. So this all kind of came about because Ian and colleagues of ours, we've been talking a lot about the ecosystem services and possible disservices that are provided in cities and maybe non-urban areas, and how those services and disservices can change depending on the context in which we view these species. So we recently published a paper on this theme of asking what is considered an ecosystem service, or can it be considered a disservice depending on that context. So using birds as an example group, we can talk about, for instance, birdsong. So in a non-urban context, let's say you go out and you're looking for birds. You want to hear the beautiful bird calling and being just exposed to that nature, letting it sink in for your mental and physical health. It's something that you possibly enjoy. But in a city context, that bird, that singing sounds lovely, but not at 4 a.m. when you're trying to sleep in and you just hear this warbling bird right outside your window waking you up. Or you may hear a jackdaw crowing. It's not the most beautiful sounding species. So if it's still a service, or is it a disservice? It depends on the context. So we were interested in exploring how that is also integrated into urban parks using birds as a tool. So we are still in the process of conducting this study, but we were interested in how people could assess biodiversity in these parks, how they are perceiving what services birds provide, or if they are providing some kind of disservice in these urban spaces, but also how the context of the park influences these perceptions. So we surveying parks along an urban gradient. All of these would be important to know in order to manage these parks for the future, for biodiversity planning, but also for how people are interacting in these spaces. So again, we only have 2 months of data. We're continuing to do these surveys until August this year, but for now we have over 100 surveys from folks in these parks. So some key things that I've already been seeing in the results for now. People are awful at assessing biodiversity. So we found that people actually were grossly underestimating what birds were there, which is opposite of what I was expecting. A lot of papers suggest that people overestimate biodiversity in these spaces, but people were awful, at least in Columbia, at recognizing what birds were there. So we did that by not only giving these surveys to people, just saying, you know, how many bird species do you think are in this park? And we gave them groups to kind of go from. And at the same time, we're doing bird surveys of the park to know exactly what is there when these people are answering these surveys. So they're tied together. So 70% estimated under the value. So people interacting with these spaces, even though they are quite diverse, people don't think that there's a lot of species there. However, the people that were most accurate were the ones interacting with the most urban parks. The bird species communities were pretty darn similar along the urban gradient. So the difference in species richness from the most urban park to the least urban park, maybe we're 5 or 10 species off. It's not a huge, huge difference. So for whatever reason, people in cities were better at determining how many species were there. And interestingly as well, even though people think there are very few birds in these parks, they want to conserve them. Over 82% said that they agreed or strongly agreed with the statement that these birds are worth saving and protecting in our cities. So they don't think there's a lot there, but the ones that are there clearly are important to them. Looking at the trends in our ecosystem services, not surprisingly, people thought that birds provided more services than disservices in these parklands. When we were looking at the services that birds provide, the group that we were interested in looking at, aesthetics, human health, and environmental regulation, people thought that birds provided the most value in terms of their aesthetics, with the statement of birds enhancing the park's beauty being the most agreed upon statement. In terms of disservices, they were tied closely with human health. So people generally thought birds were a detriment to human health, and the disservice statement of bird droppings make a mess was the most supported in terms of all of our disservices. But looking into this data, again, we don't have a lot so far, but we'll see how it goes as we collect more. But for now, if we look at the parks from the least urban to the most urban, the ecosystem services are pretty high. So there's still a lot of agreement with the services that birds provide in cities in terms of the beauty. Where we see the most difference is the disservices. From the least urban park, where people didn't agree too much about bird droppings make a mess, to the most urban park, where they were seeing more disservices, at least the perceptions of those disservices in these locations. So, even though that there's a low perception of bird diversity, there's generally still some support for their conservation. People were responding positively to how they were interacting with birds with their song and the beauty, so the aesthetics. But clearly, the setting and the context in which we are viewing these spaces are incredibly important to shaping perceptions of these park visitors, with more urban park visitors viewing these species as a detriment to their health in some context. So even though, again, the bird community is very similar across that urban gradient, Canada geese are at every single park. They're nesting every single park. They poop at every single park. Why is it that the urban park visitors are perceiving these as more of an issue than the non-urban park? So how do we tackle that in terms of the management? Do we put more interpretive signage in the urban parks? I don't know the answer to that right now. So hopefully with more data, we'll start answering these questions. So overall, to wrap up, while as an urban ecologist, I want to make our green spaces biodiverse, healthy, to create these sustainable cities, we need to balance these needs from our wildlife perspective, but also a human perspective. So in green spaces, definitely managing them for wildlife, but also keeping in mind having some areas of maintained open space for people to positively perceive these lots, to utilize these green spaces, areas of play, maybe having some signage or something in these locations. But people can be very creative with that management, like this vacant lot in Baltimore called the Sunflower Village. We need to understand the contents of how these green space features play into these perceptions, but also how they influence biodiversity goals. At the same time, recognizing that the context matters across cities. Baltimore and Columbia are very different, but also within the same city along that urban gradient. So I'm excited about the future of this project and kind of moving forward with some additional projects that maybe result from it. But for now, I appreciate your attention. Thank you all so much, and happy to have a full conversation with you all about this, whether it's now or this is my email. Feel free to shoot me an email. I'm here till the 9th. So if you want to grab coffee, always happy to have a conversation. But thank you all so much. I appreciate it.